Amilcar Cabral, The Mind That Empires Feared. Chapter 1. Roots in a Divided World. Amilcar López Cabral was born on September 12, 1924, in Bafata, a small town in the interior of Guinea-Bissau, then called Portuguese Guinea, one of the harshest colonies in the Portuguese Empire. His birth alone carried symbolism. He entered the world in a land shaped by forced labor, taxation, and strict racial hierarchies, yet he would grow to challenge every structure that tried to define him. His early childhood unfolded between Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, two lands united by colonial rule but divided by contrasting realities. The Portuguese Empire had engineered a painful system. Cape Verde, with its mixed population, its long history of droughts, and its limited resources, was seen as a more civilized colony in the racist imagination of Europe. Guinea-Bissau, meanwhile, was viewed as a reservoir of labor and raw materials, destined for exploitation, not development. Cabral's family life reflected these contradictions. His father, Juvenal Cabral, was a school teacher, one of the rare Africans permitted to hold such a position, while his mother, Eva Pinhel Evera, known to many simply as No Eva, worked tirelessly to keep her children fed during the most brutal years of drought and famine in Cape Verde. Famine was not occasional. It was structural. It was political. The colonial government's policies ensured that Cape Verdeans lived in a cycle of hunger and dependence. By the time Cabral was 5, he had already witnessed scenes that would shape his political consciousness. Children collapsing in the streets because their families could not afford the colonial taxes. Farmers forced to abandon their land to work in Portuguese cotton fields. Elders beaten for failing to meet quotas that no human being could fulfill. But most importantly, he saw how colonial rule attacked the identity of the people. In Cape Verde, children were taught that Portuguese was the only civilized language, and their own Creole was a barrier to progress. They were taught Portuguese history, Portuguese heroes, Portuguese saints, but never their own. The message was clear. To be African was to be inferior. Cabral absorbed all of this, not with anger, but with a quiet, sharp understanding. He saw that colonialism was not simply physical domination. It was psychological, cultural, a war fought inside the mind long before bullets were fired. Years later, he would express this truth in a single sentence that would echo through liberation movements across Africa. To destroy a people, you must first destroy their culture. This understanding began forming in him as a child, long before he could put it into words. Chapter 2. A Mind Awakens in Portugal. When Cabral earned a scholarship to study in Portugal, he was not merely joining a university. He was entering the center of the colonial world. Lisbon in the late 1940s was the capital of the Estado Novo dictatorship, led by Antonio Salazar, a regime built on censorship, nationalism, and an unshakable belief in Portugal's civilizing mission. Cabral moved in a world where Africans were expected to remain silent, grateful, invisible. The very presence of African students in Portuguese universities made the regime uncomfortable. The secret police, PAIGC, monitored these young men closely, recording their conversations, tracking their letters, noting any sign of subversive ambition. But Cabral was not alone. At the Lisbon School of Agronomy, he formed friendships that would define the history of Lusophone Africa. He met men like Agostinho Neto, who would later lead Angola's independence struggle, Eduardo Mondlane, who would found Frelimo and fight for Mozambique, Mario de Andrade, who would become one of the intellectual architects of African revolution in the Portuguese Empire. They were students during the day, but at night, in apartments filled with cigarette smoke, African poetry, and political discussion, they became the nucleus of an ideological storm. These gatherings were not casual meetings. They were strategy sessions, history workshops, cultural reawakening. They studied anti-colonial struggles from Vietnam to Algeria. They analyzed the failures of earlier rebellions. They debated identity, African, Creole, Black, Cape Verdean, Guinean, and how to shape a unified movement without falling into tribalism or rivalry. Cabral stood out not because he spoke the loudest, but because he listened the deepest. He asked questions that cut to the essence of colonial rule. Why do Africans accept the colonizers' version of themselves? Why do some Africans defend the empire? What must be restored before liberation can begin? In these years, he developed his central theory. Liberation is not a switch. It is a long rebuilding of consciousness. He refused to romanticize African society, acknowledging internal contradictions, class hierarchies, and divisions. But he insisted that colonialism had twisted African identity into something unrecognizable, and that the struggle must begin by restoring dignity, language, and self-worth. By the time Cabral graduated, he was not just an agronomist. He was the intellectual foundation of a revolution. Chapter 3. Returning to a land ready to erupt. When Cabral returned to Portuguese Guinea in 1952, the colony was still trapped in the medieval labor system the Portuguese called chibalo. Villagers were forced to work on peanut plantations or cut trees for export. Taxes were imposed even on families with no money. Whole communities were relocated if their land was needed for colonial companies. Cabral's job, on paper, was to conduct an agricultural census. In reality, he used this opportunity to traverse more than 3,000 kilometers on foot, by canoe, and on horseback, moving through the forests, savannas, and river plains of the territory. He did not simply collect data, he built a psychological map of the country. He learned which villages had grievances, which chiefs were respected, which families had lost sons to forced labor, which areas the Portuguese ignored, which ethnic groups could form alliances, which traditions colonialism failed to erase. And most importantly, he learned how deeply the people trusted him. The villagers saw something different in Cabral. He spoke softly, without superiority. He listened to their stories as if they were intellectual lectures. He ate with them, slept in their huts, laughed with their children. He became a familiar face, not a colonial official. These 2 years created something the Portuguese did not expect. Cabral built a silent, invisible network of trust across the rural interior. It was this foundation, not weapons, not ideology, not foreign support, that made the PAIGC the most effective liberation movement in West Africa. Cabral had discovered the soul of the country, and soon he would awaken it. By the mid-1950s, the Portuguese Empire was under increasing pressure. Across Africa, colonial structures were collapsing. Ghana was approaching independence. Algeria's war was raging. Senegal and Guinea were stirring. But Portugal, under Salazar, insisted that its colonies were not colonies at all, but overseas provinces. This was a lie, and Cabral knew it. In 1956, in a small, unremarkable room in Bissau, Amilcar Cabral and a handful of trusted comrades met in secret. The room was empty except for a table, some chairs, and notebooks filled with Cabral's observations from his years surveying the country. There were no flags, no weapons, no grand speeches, only conviction. This was the birth of the PAIGC, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. It was not yet an army, not yet a political powerhouse, not even a mass movement. It was an idea, a seed planted by a man who knew that revolutions do not begin with guns, but with clarity. Cabral insisted that the PAIGC must differ from other liberation movements. It must reject personality cults, tribal favoritism, opportunistic alliances, empty slogans, brutality against civilians. He believed that the African struggle had to be morally superior to colonial rule, not because Europe demanded it, but because African dignity demanded it.
In the early meetings, Cabral would repeat the same message. Our struggle is not against the Portuguese people, but against Portuguese colonialism. Never confuse the two. It was a message of discipline, not hatred, of vision, not revenge.
The PAIGC started small, but it grew quietly, village by village, family by family, whisper by whisper. Teachers, nurses, farmers, fishermen all became part of a quiet awakening. Cabral knew that before a gun could be lifted, the mind had to rise first. On August 3, 1959, in the port of PAIGC in Bissau, dock workers launched a peaceful strike. They were protesting unbearable working conditions, low wages, and the colonial administrators' refusal to negotiate. These were not militants. They were laborers, fathers, uncles, sons, simply demanding fairness.
Cabral and the PAIGC leadership had hoped the strike would become a symbol of peaceful resistance.
But the Portuguese colonial police opened fire. Bullets scattered across the port. Men fell into the water. Others were beaten. Some drowned, unable to swim under the weight of their clothes and the chaos around them. The screams echoed across the city, but the colonial authorities reported it coldly as a necessary response. It was not merely a massacre, it was a turning point.
Cabral later said, PAIGC marked the end of illusions.
Until that moment, he had hoped that Portugal, pressured by the wave of African independence, might negotiate. But PAIGC proved that the colonial regime would rather kill unarmed workers than concede anything. That day, the people understood something profound. The colonizer would never give freedom. It had to be taken. And the PAIGC transformed overnight from a political movement to the embryo of a liberation army. After PAIGC, the PAIGC leadership knew they needed a safe base. Portugal's surveillance was too tight in Bissau. So Cabral moved his operations to Conakry, the capital of Guinea, with the approval of President Sékou Touré. From Conakry, Cabral began one of the most remarkable nation-building efforts in African history, before the nation even existed. He organized political education sessions, military training, literacy programs, agricultural cooperatives, women's mobilization groups, youth brigades, clandestine schools, village conferences, field hospitals. But this was not simply organization. It was transformation. Cabral believed that the African peasants of Guinea-Bissau, ignored by the world, dismissed by the colonizers, were the true engine of liberation. Though nearly 80% of the population was illiterate in European terms, Cabral insisted they possess deep wisdom and resilience.
He said, "We are not educating them. We are reawakening what colonialism tried to bury."
In the villages, PAIGC militants did something revolutionary. They learned local languages, respected traditional authorities, and adapted their movement to local customs. This was unheard of in many other liberation struggles. Cabral refused to impose outside ideology. Instead, he let the people teach him. This humility built an extraordinary level of trust. Fathers gave their sons to the cause. Mothers sheltered guerrillas. Villagers walked miles to deliver information. The countryside became the PAIGC's natural fortress. By 1962, the PAIGC was prepared, politically, psychologically, and structurally, for the next phase. The Portuguese did not see what was coming. On January 23, 1963, in the forested region of Tite, the PAIGC launched its first coordinated guerrilla attack against Portuguese positions. It was a modest operation, but symbolically, it was an explosion.
For the first time in its 400-year colonial history in Guinea, Portugal faced an organized African enemy determined not only to resist, but to win. Cabral was not on the battlefield. His battlefield was the mind. While fighters ambushed Portuguese convoys, Cabral crafted political strategy, delivered speeches that elevated morale, and built diplomatic relations across Africa, Asia, and the socialist world.
The PAIGC grew quickly. Villages expelled colonial administrators. Militants reclaimed farmlands. Schools reopened under PAIGC control. The movement built its own police, courts, and health posts. Portugal responded with brutal counterinsurgency, burning villages, torturing prisoners, and deploying napalm in rural zones. But nothing worked. Cabral had built something Portugal did not understand, a population that believed in the cause more than they feared the colonizer. This phase of the war saw the rise of remarkable individuals. Women commanders like Titina Sila, youth leaders, village chiefs who became political educators, and farmers turned soldiers whose knowledge of the land made them almost invisible to Portuguese patrols. The countryside had changed. It now belonged to the people. By 1964, the PAIGC had evolved from a small insurgent group into one of the most sophisticated liberation movements in Africa. What distinguished Cabral's organization from others was not just military skill, it was structure. Unlike many revolutions that relied on a charismatic leader and scattered fighters, Cabral created a system where every role served the movement. Teachers became political instructors, farmers became supply managers, women became intelligence officers, youth became couriers and scouts, elders became advisors, fighters became community organizers. Portugal, on the other hand, remained locked in the 19th century, convinced it could rule through force alone. But Cabral understood something Portugal did not. A population that has conquered fear is ungovernable. In the liberated zones, territories under PAIGC control, Cabral's ideas became reality. These areas were not temporary guerrilla hideouts. They were the foundation of a future nation. Schools were reopened under trees, where barefoot children wrote letters in chalk on pieces of slate. Women formed committees that managed food, education, and local decision-making. Villagers learned how to irrigate land using simple techniques taught by Cabral himself, drawing from his training as an agronomist. He had a remarkable way of blending his scientific background with revolutionary practicality. He once stopped a meeting to explain the importance of crop rotation to a group of farmers who had lost harvests due to soil exhaustion. In another village, he spent hours helping women design a schedule for grinding millet, ensuring that fighters and civilians could both be fed. His leadership style was quiet, but transformative. He did not shout commands. He explained reasons. Through patient education, he built not only an army, but a conscious people. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Cabral movement was the rise of women. In many African liberation movements, women played crucial, but often invisible roles. Cabral refused invisibility. He insisted, "The liberation of women is a fundamental necessity for the revolution. The revolution cannot triumph without this." Under his guidance, PAIGC formally integrated women into combat units, political leadership, logistics, medical teams, intelligence networks. Women like Teodora Gomez, Carmen Pereira, and Titina Sila became central figures in the movement. Titina Sila in particular embodied the struggle. Young, fearless, and fiercely intelligent, she crossed rivers with ammunition strapped to her back, marched for days through forest, commanded fighters in battle, and became a symbol of the new society Cabral was building. The Portuguese often found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see, because women, moving quietly between villages, carried information, weapons, and food that sustained the resistance. Cabral once said in a meeting, "In our land, women carry the weight of life. In this struggle, they will carry the weight of freedom." These words were not symbolic. They were operational reality. The Portuguese government grew increasingly frustrated. Guinea-Bissau was supposed to be a small colony, a minor province, a footnote in the empire. Instead, it became the empire's bleeding wound. Portugal began deploying methods learned from other colonial wars: psychological warfare, scorched earth tactics, and chemical attacks. Villages suspected of helping the PAIGC were burned, farmers were beaten, food supplies were destroyed. Some accounts speak of poison being used in wells and crops, although Portuguese records deny it. Still, none of this stopped the movement. In many areas, the PAIGC introduced criminal courts, regulated trade, and collected grain reserves. Portugal could not retake these territories without massive troop deployments, And even when they tried, their soldiers were ambushed by fighters who knew every path, every stream, every shadow. The war became a contest of wills. Portugal fought to retain a colony. The PAIGC fought to build a nation.
The Portuguese are fighting to remain who they are. We are fighting to become who we must be.
While the war raged, Cabral became something few revolutionary leaders managed to be simultaneously: an intellectual, a military strategist, and a global diplomat. Invited to conferences across Africa, Asia, and the Eastern Bloc, he presented the PAIGC not as rebels, but as the legitimate representatives of a people seeking sovereignty. In Algiers, Cairo, Dar es Salaam, Havana, and Moscow, Cabral spoke with a clarity that impressed even seasoned diplomats. His ability to articulate the philosophy of liberation in simple but profound terms made him one of the most respected African thinkers of his time. At a conference in Havana, Fidel Castro listened to Cabral as if absorbing every word. Years later, Castro said, "Cabral was a man of extraordinary intelligence and modesty. He was one of the great figures of contemporary Africa." Through his diplomacy, the PAIGC secured international recognition, medical support, military training, educational programs, political alliances, diplomatic pressure on Portugal. But most importantly, Cabral shifted the world's understanding of colonialism. He explained that the Portuguese Empire survived not because of military strength, but because of internalized inferiority among the colonized. He said, "Colonialism is not just the sum of economic exploitation, it is also the denial of a people's history, their identity, their dignity." This message resonated deeply with anti-colonial movements across the global South. By 1971, something extraordinary had happened in West Africa. A European empire, backed by NATO, supported by the West, armed with modern weapons, was losing a war to villagers armed with rifles older than their grandfathers. And at the center of this phenomenon stood Amilcar Cabral. From the outside, the PAIGC seemed unstoppable. From the inside, Cabral knew this moment was fragile. He understood that victory increases pressure, and pressure reveals cracks. But militarily, the PAIGC was stronger than ever. Portugal could not hold the countryside anymore. Entire regions, from the southern forests of Quitafine to the eastern zones of Farim, had fallen permanently under PAIGC control. In some areas, Portuguese soldiers could not step outside their barracks without facing ambushes. Supply lines were repeatedly cut. Patrols disappeared. Small Portuguese units often refused to travel by road at night. Foreign journalists who visited the liberated zones wrote reports that embarrassed Portugal internationally. They described schools filled with children reciting poems of freedom, women leading agricultural cooperatives, village meetings where decisions were made collectively, medical posts where nurses treated wounded civilians, disciplined fighters who refused to steal or mistreat villagers. One journalist from Sweden wrote, "If I did not know this was a war zone, I would believe I was in a young, functioning country." This was Cabral's strategy: win the land, win the people, build the nation even before independence. Portugal had guns. Cabral had legitimacy. Chapter 13: The Secret War, Portugal's Infiltration Efforts. Portugal realized they could not win militarily, so they turned to infiltration, manipulation, and intelligence warfare. The Portuguese Secret Police, PAIGC, began studying the PAIGC's internal structure, trying to find weaknesses. They focused on tribal tensions, Cape Verdean versus Guinean resentment, jealousy among commanders, disputes over resources, frustrations over long deployments, family members under colonial pressure. Cabral was aware of all this. He had predicted it years earlier when he wrote, "If we are defeated, it will not be because the enemy is stronger. It will be because we betrayed ourselves." But even the greatest thinker cannot prevent every human weakness. Inside the PAIGC, a dangerous issue was growing: ethnic suspicion. Some Guinean fighters believed the movement was dominated by Cape Verdeans. Some Cape Verdeans believed the Guineans were becoming too powerful. Cabral had tried to destroy tribalism intellectually, but colonialism had planted those seeds deeply. Portugal now watered them quietly. PAIGC agents offered money, safe passage, revenge, promises of power to anyone willing to destabilize the movement. Most refused. A few listened, and among those few were men who would change the future. Cabral carried the weight of two nations, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, on his shoulders, and his burden became heavier as victory approached. He traveled constantly, between training camps, diplomatic trips abroad, meetings with village elders, strategy sessions, negotiations with foreign governments, visits to wounded fighters, political education classes. He slept little, he ate irregularly, he wrote speeches at night and taught during the day.
Do not confuse freedom with power. The people are not fighting so that a few among us may become rich or powerful.
He understood the danger clearly. A liberation movement can win a war and still lose its soul. Cabral fought two enemies. 1. The Portuguese Empire. 2. Human weakness inside the movement. The second enemy was far more dangerous. Chapter 15. The beginning of betrayal. Among the PAIGC's ranks was a small faction of dissatisfied members, particularly in the dockworkers community. Men who had suffered deeply under colonial rule, who respected Cabral but felt they were not receiving enough recognition. Portugal identified these frustrations and inflamed them. Some fighters began to whisper, "Why are the Cape Verdeans in higher leadership positions? Why does Cabral travel abroad while we fight and die? Why is progress slow in the north? Why are resources limited? Why must we obey without questioning?"
These were real frustrations, but they were also the cracks Portugal needed. Cabral sensed the danger. He organized internal meetings urging unity, reminding them that leadership is a responsibility, not a privilege. Liberation creates expectations. Colonialism creates division. Freedom requires discipline.
But not everyone listened. In late 1972, Portuguese intelligence reached out to a group of disgruntled PAIGC members in Conakry. It began quietly, a meeting in secret, promises whispered in dark corners, small offers of money, appeals to wounded pride. Among the conspirators were men Cabral had trusted personally. The betrayal had begun. By late 1972, the PAIGC was closer to victory than ever before. The countryside of Guinea-Bissau was essentially liberated. Only the cities, Bissau, Bolama, and Bafata, remained under firm Portuguese control. Cabral returned to Conakry often now, traveling between the front lines and the political capital of the movement. Conakry, under President Sékou Touré, served as a safe haven for many African liberation groups, but it was not without tension. Inside the PAIGC, the pressure of years of war, exhaustion, and political rivalry was building. Some fighters felt distant from the leadership. Some leaders felt unappreciated. Portugal was fully aware of these cracks and pressed its advantage.
If we lose this struggle, it will not be because the Portuguese defeated us. It will be because we defeated ourselves.
The group that would eventually betray Cabral consisted mostly of PAIGC members from the dockworkers' ranks. These men were not traitors by ideology. They were wounded men, emotionally, politically, psychologically. They had lost family members, suffered humiliations, and felt they were not given enough recognition in the movement. Portugal, through its intelligence networks, studied them carefully, and they played on every frustration. Why are the Cape Verdeans in charge? Why does Cabral make decisions from abroad? Why don't you have more leadership positions? Why should you die while others lead? One of the central figures in this group was Inocencio Cani, a strong fighter, known for his loyalty to the struggle, but also for his temper. Another was Mamadou Touré, and a few others whose names history remembers only as pieces of a tragic night. Their motivations were mixed. Some wanted more power. Some believed Cabral favored Cape Verdeans over Guineans. Some were manipulated directly by Portuguese agents. Some were simply tired and desperate. But all of them, in one way or another, were caught in a net they didn't fully understand. The Portuguese knew exactly what they wanted. Cabral dead, not the PAIGC defeated, but its spirit broken. It was a cool, quiet evening in Conakry. Street lamps flickered over the neighborhood of Donka, where many PAIGC leaders lived. Children played nearby, women cooked meals, fighters returned from training camps. The city felt like a temporary peace in the middle of a long war. Cabral and his wife, Ana Maria, had been driving home after a meeting. They stopped at their house, unaware that men they trusted were waiting for them in the shadows. As Cabral stepped out of the car, the conspirators surrounded him. They demanded that he accompany them to PAIGC headquarters. Cabral refused, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Voices rose. A struggle began. Ana Maria screamed for help. In the chaos, one of the conspirators struck Cabral. He stumbled. Another pulled a pistol. For a moment, a small, tragic moment, the street was silent. Then a gunshot shattered the night. Cabral fell. Neighbors rushed out. Some of the conspirators panicked. Others tried to drag him away. Guinean soldiers nearby heard the noise and began to run toward the scene. The conspirators fled toward the sea but were captured minutes later.
Do not destroy unity. Do not avenge me on my own brothers.
Sékou Touré reacted swiftly and brutally. Within hours, he ordered the arrest of every conspirator. Some were executed. Some were tortured. Some disappeared into prison cells whose walls never spoke again.
Amilca Cabral was not only the leader of the PAIGC, he was the pride of Africa. His blood will strengthen the struggle, not weaken it.
Across the continent, leaders from Algeria to Tanzania mourned him. In Havana, Fidel Castro declared 3 days of mourning. In Sweden, students carried his picture through the streets. In Lagos, poets wrote elegies. In Cape Verde, elders cried openly. But in Lisbon, the Portuguese government reacted with cold satisfaction. They believed the PAIGC would collapse. They did not understand the movement Cabral built. Instead of collapsing, the PAIGC accelerated. Leaders like Aristides Pereira, Luis Cabral, and Pedro Pires stepped forward. The military command remained disciplined. The people, whose hearts Cabral had won through years of education, continued to support the struggle.
They declared the independence of Guinea-Bissau in September 1973, recognized by more than 60 countries.
Portugal refused to accept it, but they were fighting a losing war. On April 25, 1974, the Carnation Revolution erupted in Portugal. Soldiers overthrew the dictatorship. One of the first decisions of the new government was to end the colonial wars. Guinea-Bissau became officially independent. Cape Verde followed in 1975. Cabral did not live to see these victories, but his fingerprints were on every flag raised, every anthem sung, every liberation march. Chapter 21. The Philosopher of Liberation. Long before he ever held a rifle or led a campaign, Cabral was a thinker, not a philosopher in the academic sense, but in the African sense. A man whose understanding of land, people, and identity formed a worldview that blended tradition with revolution.
His speeches were not written for foreign audiences. They were written for the peasants of Guinea-Bissau. And yet, scholars in Latin America, Europe, and the Caribbean studied him like a professor.
He broke down colonialism not as a military occupation alone, but as the denial of identity, the destruction of culture, the fragmentation of society, the theft of history, the suppression of dignity.
You are not fighting to be Portuguese. You are fighting to be yourselves.
This sounds simple, but within those words lies the secret to why his movement succeeded. Cabral understood that colonialism works by convincing the oppressed that they are inferior. Once that lie is shattered, the empire breaks. He believed that liberation required 3 acts. 1. Recovering history. 2. Rebuilding culture. 3. Reclaiming the land. And that is exactly what he did, step by step, village by village, mind by mind. Chapter 22, Return to the Source. One of Cabral's most important concepts was what he called return to the source. For him, the source was not a place. It was the internal self of a people, their traditions, their worldview, their rhythm, their collective memory. Colonialism had tried to erase this. Cabral wanted to bring it back. He argued that Africans did not need to borrow their dignity from Europe. They did not need to borrow ideologies blindly. They had their own philosophies, their own systems of justice, their own ways of making decisions, their own spiritual and cultural coherence. His idea was revolutionary because it was not romantic. He never said African culture was perfect. He acknowledged weaknesses, tribalism, social hierarchies, patriarchy, superstition. But he insisted that healing these weaknesses must come from within, not from colonial influence. He said, "We must not return to the past. We must return to the source, and from there, move forward." This idea shaped movements far beyond West Africa. Chapter 23, Global Impact, a Teacher of Revolutions. Long after his death, Cabral's writings spread across the world. In South Africa, members of the ANC studied his works in exile camps. Nelson Mandela once wrote that Cabral's clarity illuminated the path of all oppressed peoples. In Mozambique, Frelimo used Cabral's political education model to build unity among diverse ethnic groups. In Angola, the MPLA adopted Cabral's emphasis on political consciousness, not just military victory. In Cuba, Fidel Castro held Cabral in extraordinary esteem. He later said, "Cabral was the most lucid voice of the African Revolution." In Brazil, Afro-Brazilian movements embraced Cabral's definition of culture as a battleground. His ideas helped shape the growth of black consciousness movements in Bahia and Rio de Janeiro. In the Caribbean, intellectuals like Walter Rodney, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and C.L.R. James referenced him as a foundational thinker. Even in the United States, the Black Panther Party republished portions of his speeches. Eldridge Cleaver once described Cabral as a philosopher of dignity. Cabral belonged to Guinea and Cape Verde, but he spoke to the entire world. Chapter 24. Why Portugal feared him. Portugal did not fear Cabral because he commanded fighters. They feared him because he commanded understanding. Military leaders can be killed, armies can be defeated, territory can be retaken. But an idea that liberates the mind, that is a threat to any empire. Cabral offered Africa something Europe could not destroy with bullets: confidence, clarity, education, identity, unity, political discipline, cultural pride. These tools last longer than rifles. The Portuguese called him dangerous, not because he hated them, he did not. Not because he preached violence, he often avoided it. But because he made Africans believe they deserved to be free. Empires can tolerate rebels. They cannot tolerate consciousness. And that is why Cabral had to be removed. Chapter 25. The legacy that refuses to die. When independence came to Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, the world praised the victory. But the man who made it possible was no longer alive. And yet, the greatest proof of Cabral's success is this: the movement he built continued winning after his death. Few liberation leaders achieve that. Many movements collapse when their founders fall. But Cabral had built institutions, not worship. He built systems, not slogans. He built a people, not a personality cult. In the decades after independence, Guinea-Bissau faced coups and instability. Cape Verde chose stability and democratic evolution. Both nations kept Cabral's memory as a moral compass. But beyond the politics, his greatest legacy is intellectual. Universities around the world still study him. African youths still quote him. Revolutionaries still stand on his shoulders. Poets still write in his spirit. His words survive in every corner of the global South. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. A line written almost casually became the ethical foundation of political movements from Maputo to Dakar to Kingston. Cabral's vision was not just independence. It was the creation of a just society, one where power serves the people, not the other way around. Chapter 26. Closing, the man who grew nations from the earth. In the end, Cabral was not a soldier, not a president, not a king, not a man who chased glory. He was something far rarer, a revolutionary with the heart of a teacher. He once said, "I am a simple African man fulfilling my duty." But history disagreed. History wrote him among the greats. And if you walk today in the forests of Guinea-Bissau, where children still learn under trees, if you travel through Cape Verde, where the land still remembers drought but now lives in dignity, you will feel his presence in the wind. The man they killed could not be defeated, because the idea he planted had already taken root in the soil, in the villages, in the hearts, in the memory of the people. They killed Amilcar Cabral, but they could not kill what he awakened.